This video is just one part of a set of videos called Making Effective Selections, and as you can see here, the subject is making fine detailed selections using Select and Mask. Any photographer who's looking to make complex cutouts containing fine detail like hair, and to do it automatically in a couple of clicks, then you're likely to be disappointed. The simple reason is that every image is different. It's different in content, sharpness and lighting, so there just cannot be a one-size-fits-all solution. So let me take you through the process that I used to take this young lady and remove her from the background, and to place her in a woodland forest. A little bit of shadow underneath to make it a little more realistic, and also a layer there to help with the fringing of the hair. Now, as you can see by the spinning round of the screen, I've zoomed in to the young lady so you can take a look at the hairline to see what sort of a cutout I've managed to achieve. Now, I don't think I've got this perfect by a long way, but I suppose really I'm going to need to leave it up to you to decide if I've got an acceptable result. I'm going to hit Ctrl+0 to fit the image back on screen. Now, I don't think it's going to be entirely practical if I take you through this in a real-time step-by-step way. So I'm going to describe what I've done in certain circumstances because they're no different to what we've already covered in other videos. I made a careful selection of the entire subject, and I used a combination of tools like the polygonal lasso and the freehand lasso tool, and I saved my selection as I went along. With the spinning round of the screen once more, I've opened up the image that I created my selection with, and because I've got it saved I can retrieve it, so let's do that first. I'm going to go to my select menu and choose load a selection, and in the channel here, in the drop down channel, that's what I'm looking for, my basic selection, and there you can see it. I'm going to pick up my zoom tool here and I'll zoom in to the base. You may notice that I've gone around the skirt and the feet of the model quite carefully, so I've got a very good selection there. I've made a little gap between the arm and the body. In fact, there's a tiny little gap over on the left hand side. Whether that's worth actually cutting out, I think, is a debatable point. So I've got a sharp selection all the way up the arms and around the shoulders, but as I get to the head, you can see I've not been quite so fussy about making a selection around the hair, because what we're going to do is to use Select and Mask, and we're going to refine the selection to try to pick up as much of the hair as we possibly can. Now I'm going to make a start on refining the edge of the selection around the hair by opening up Select and Mask from the Select menu at the top of the screen. As you know, there's a number of ways we can view the image. Many people choose slightly different ones. What I'm going to do here, I'm going to use overlay, and we can adjust the opacity of that overlay, because what I want to do, I want to be able to see the area that I currently have masked, and we can see that by the hair showing naturally, but I also need to see the part that I've got to work on. What we're going to do is use this tool over on the top left of the screen, which is going to allow us to refine the edge of our selection. We do have some other tools here. This one, if we select it, this one has a plus and minus. It does allow us, if I come down here for example, I can start to tease out the selection in certain places, but there you can see I've gone too far. So I'll hit Ctrl+Z, but in certain circumstances that could be useful, as well as the subtract option too. Down here we just have a solid selector, so if I wanted to just tease out a selection just down there I can do so. and the other three I think you're pretty familiar with by now, but it's this one that's going to give us the opportunity to refine the edge of the hair. Now it's pretty simple work, but we have to work carefully. I'm going to drop my brush size down just a little bit, and I'm just going to work over the edge of that hair and allow Photoshop to do its work. And it's pretty good work, I have to say. I'm trying not to go over areas too often, but I'm keeping my eye on that overlay that I've got. And what I tend to do is to go around the edge just a little at a time, looking at what I'm doing, being careful. But it doesn't take too much skill. That's the whole point of the refine edge. Photoshop is doing the work for us. Now I've speeded up the process quite a bit by taking my time around the edge, but then we need to come back down to the bottom right of the screen to the output options, because what I want to do here is to output this to a layer mask. When I click OK, I'll hit Ctrl+0 to fit the image on screen. Now when we see our young lady floating on a transparent background, she looks pretty good. Now as you can see by that change on screen, I'm just speeding up the process just a little bit. I put a new blank layer beneath my model and I flooded it with green. So if we look at the edge of the hair, it actually doesn't look too bad. Maybe we've got a little problem up here. Well, one of the ways we can deal with that is if we select the image we're working on and we create a new blank layer here, I'm going to create it above. What I'm going to do is to clip this layer to this one. Now to do that we hold the Alt key, and as we move over that line you can see we get a change in the icon, and when I click, and if you get it right, I'll hit Ctrl+Z, which I didn't get right. If you click, what it does is it clips this layer to this layer, because what I want to do is paint on this layer with a colour that's very similar colour to the hair, to try to bring up the strands of hair just around here, which I think maybe are going a little bit too dark, or they're losing their colour, and maybe there's a little bit of fringing there. We can rename the layer if we wish. I'm going to select my soft edge brush from the toolbox, and I'm going to start with my flow rate down quite low. I think I'll choose 5%, and with this little icon checked I can change the flow rate with 0.5, the numbers on my keyboard. I'll drop the size of the brush down, but I only want to use the edge of it. Now if I zoom in just a little more, you can see the problem. If I hold the Alt key, my brush changes to the color sampler. So if I sample a light color from the hair here and then release, what I can do is just go over them, and you'll notice that we're only painting, and I may need to increase the flow rate a little bit. I'm going to go to 10% by hitting the number 1 key. You can see what I'm doing here. I'm taking away that ghosting, but we have to be a bit careful with what we're doing here. And I'm going to move around and do this gently all around the edge. There you can see it's just improving matters, just making a bit more of the hair around the model's head. And because we are painting on this layer and it's clipped to this layer, then nothing appears outside, but if we go inside we could paint, but we don't want to paint over the solid areas, we only want to pick out the bit of the hair. So I've got to go around the edge pretty carefully, making sure I don't overdo things, but you can see it's starting to have a positive effect as long as we take it slow and we work in a methodical and delicate way. As I slowly worked around the head of the model, I pushed the flow rate up to about 20%, but the 20% started to run away with me, so I found in practice to do that delicate work around the edge something between a 5% and a 10% flow. But I think I've got it about as good as I'm likely to get it. So we need to think about what we're going to do next. Now, when you think about the mask that I first made, I made it pretty solid down the dress and around the feet and the arms. So there's no feather been put into that selection at all. But of course now we've certainly made quite a considerable difference to the selection around the model's head. But if I were to go into my layer mask now, double click and start to input any feather into this, then that's obviously going to impact the hair. I only want to impact the edge. I may want to soften the edge of the arms, and maybe I'd want to soften the edge of the dress a little bit more than the arms. So we're going to do that in a slightly different way too. I'll cancel that and we'll come back out. So to affect the edge of the selection that controls the dress, because you can see that it's far too sharp, what I'm going to use is the blur tool to just blur the edge. I mean, there you get a good example of it there. You can see the jagged nature of the cutout. It's just a straight selection and a cutout. So all of these edges need to be blurred, but I think it's probably best to do them when we've got the young lady in the new location. So I think the very next thing I need to do, once I've made sure I've got all the work that I've done here safely saved, and I want to keep all of these layers, although I don't particularly need the green layer now, so let's drop that in the bin. I'll save those, and we need to open up the background that we've chosen for the model to appear in. Now, with the image that I've chosen on screen, you'll notice if you look at the thumbnail at the top right, it's a raw smart object. So before I drag the young lady into the image, I'm just thinking about the colour. The young lady's quite warm toned. She had quite well tanned skin. This was taken in overcast conditions, so it's probably got a little bit of a shift towards blue. So I think I'll correct that, but I'll keep the smart object status of this layer as long as I can. So I'm going to double click and open this back up into Camera Raw. I'm going to go up to my white balance tool at the top left of the screen, because if you look around into the water you can see evidence of blue here. So I'm going to click, see if I can correct that a little bit. See, everything's now turned nicely white. You don't have to accept what you've just clicked on or the effect you've had. You can adjust it, so if you want to take a little bit of that magenta away and you want to warm this just a little more, you've got the opportunity to do that sort of fine tuning. But everything else I think is pretty well done. The one thing we need to just bear in mind that we need to deal with later is if we're going to stand our model about here, which is what I did for compositional reasons, and if we were focusing on the young lady, then we could expect maybe our image to be sharp up to about, what, a third of the way up the frame, but then we would expect the background to start to soften quite a bit. Well, that's going to help her stand out a bit better too. But we'll deal with that a little bit later. That's not difficult to achieve with a new layer and a layer mask. So for the moment, I'm quite happy to open this up into Photoshop. Then I'll select my young lady, or I'll drag the tab out from the top there. I need to select both of those layers, click, drag and drop. I will close this down because I know I've saved it, and we can see the first problem that we've got to deal with, and that is our young lady is a little bit large in comparison to our image. So what I'm going to do here is to keep the selection on those two layers, because if we're going to resize the young lady, we need to resize that layer we used to fix the hair, and I'm going to hang on to that just a little while longer. I'm pretty certain I'm not going to need it, but just in case. So if I'm going to resize the young lady using the free transform tool, then I need to resize any of the layers I've included to help with the hair. But they're both still selected from when I dragged them in, so I'm going to use the shortcut keys of Ctrl+T to bring up the free transform. We've used Ctrl+0 quite a number of times. Ctrl+0 will fit the image on screen. The good thing about it is when we've got a bounding box, it'll fit that too. So it gives us access all the way around. When Photoshop launched its 2019 version in October 2018, it changed the way the free transform tool works. In the past, once we got the free transform tool around the subject like we have here, to drag the top corner toggles to reduce the size and to retain the same height and width, we would have had to have gone up to click this little chain link, but you'll notice they've actually reversed the way the tool works. We used to be able to hold the shift key to do the same thing. Now we hold the shift key if we distort the bounding box around the free transform, but if we don't want to, it's a simple click and drag. Now this part we've got to be a bit careful of. We've got to get it right, or I'd like to get it right first time. I'll hit Ctrl+0, that'll fit the image back on screen. So I think we need to look at this a few times to see if we're happy with that size. Let's try coming down a bit more. I think that looks okay. As soon as we go down there, it starts to look a bit too small. Maybe that's a little bit too big. I think we're all going to choose something slightly different, but I think that's okay. Now I'm probably going to move her over a little bit, maybe over to here. I'm going to hit the enter key to commit that, pick up my crop tool and just click into the crop to see the rule of thirds, because I was just guessing by the placement of the young lady, but I think I've got that about right. She seems to be leaning a little bit to our left. Is that going to be a problem? I don't know, but if it is, I could always bring up my free transform tool and just turn her very, very slightly. And I think with work like this, it's a good thing to sometimes have a timeout. A timeout is where we save the work we've done so far, and I've got this up to 3 versions, so I've got plenty of opportunity to go back to earlier versions if I suddenly discover a problem or change my mind. But a timeout also allows us to sit back in the chair, put down the pen or your mouse if you're using a mouse, and just take a look at the image and make sure everything is coming together about right. Whenever we place an object, in this case the young lady, into another image, we almost always need to give it a little bit of a shadow beneath, because otherwise it almost looks as though the young lady is hovering above the surface. If I use those shortcut keys of Control Spacebar and zoom in at the bottom, even though we're not seeing the entire picture, you can see what I mean. She looks like she's hovering above the rocks. And that's just reminded me too that we've got to deal with the softness around here. But I'd like to deal with the shadow first. That's going to be quite easy to do. I'm going to select a new blank layer, and I don't want this one clipped, so I'll unclip that and I'll drag it beneath the young lady, and I think I'll name that shadow. And maybe I should have named this one, because I've got to link that again now because I knocked that off as well. I should have named that perhaps fringing, because I did the hair with that, just so we don't get them confused. What I want to do on this shadow layer is to just give her a shadow underneath here. So it's really, I'm going to make it manually, I think. I might pick up my polygonal lasso and I may just give myself a nice shape all the way around. We can always fine-tune this a little bit later on. We're not going to see the back end of that selection or what we're going to do with this, so that's not vitally important. I could go to select a mask and give it a soft edge. So I want to make it quite soft, so No rights and wrongs here, and this is a calculated guess, and click OK. Now if I flood that with black, here's another shortcut coming up here. You can look over on the bottom of the toolbox. You can see there's still the colour I used to select for the hair. If you want to return the colours to black and white, which we do quite a bit when we're doing this sort of work, touch the D key. D for David. And the black and white returns. With the black as my foreground colour, Alt backspace floods that. I can hit Ctrl+D. There's my shadow. Now I think it's a little bit heavy, but of course we've got the opportunity to drop that back with the opacity. We can turn it on and off. See, it makes a considerable difference. What I may do a little bit later is to put a stronger shadow around the toes here, but I'll do that manually maybe, because we've got a shadow that's ghosted all around, but here I think we need something just a little bit stronger. Well, maybe we should do that straight away. So I'm going to create another new blank layer. I'm not going to go on top of the shadow layer in case I make a mistake. So we could call this toes. Black is my foreground colour. I'm going to pick up my brush. I'm going to drop the brush down. The flow rate is 10%, and all I want to do here is just give a bit of shadow along the edge here, around the toes and along. It doesn't take very much, and it's amazing what it actually does. And let's not forget a big toe underneath. Now in fact we could say that what's lying underneath the skirt there, that may be a little bit darker. So maybe I could do two things here. Maybe I could drop the flow rate down to about 5%, and I could, whoa, that's a little bit over the top. I'll hit Ctrl+Z, I'll drop it to 1%, and I'll just give that a light brush in. I'm just making the shadow just a wee bit darker in that position. Well, you can see we're all going to choose something slightly different, but it has a pretty good effect, doesn't it? If I turn them off, that looks unnatural. That I don't think would attract our attention very much. So now we need to do something with the edge of the dress. Let's start with the edge of the dress from the arms downwards on both sides. The way I'm going to do that is to zoom in. I'll start at the bottom, I think. I'm going to select the mask. I'm going to blur the edge of the mask. Now we could look just at the mask with Alt and clicking of the mask, and we could blur it and see it like that, but I'm not sure. I think I'll just select the mask and do it live here. So the tool I want is over here. I'm forgetting where I need to go. This one here. There's the sharpen tool, there's the blur tool. The strength there looks to me to be a little bit on the high side, so I think I'll drop that down to about 10%. Just hit the number 1 key there. I'm going to drop my brush size down and then start the blurring. That's it. It's as simple as that. Let me make my brush a little bit bigger maybe, and we'll go around the edge here, and that doesn't seem too bad to me at all. That 10% strength seems to be just about right. And now I can just go along around the edge, and I can nicely soften just the edge of the dress. Well, I've reached a point where I've got the young lady as good as I can get around her hair, and when we see her against the forest, of course, that does hide a few sins. I've softened the arms so they're looking quite natural, and certainly the dress all the way down, and we've got our shadow sitting beneath. I think I'm ready to move on, but what I've done in your absence, so to speak, is I have created one more layer which I've clipped to the young lady, because there's quite a strong highlight down her arm there. So I did exactly the same as we did with the hair. Let me turn it on and you can see how that highlight is reduced. Remember, all I did to achieve that is to bring the image up large, select a soft edge brush, The flow rate I used at 5%. I used the Alt key to sample the dark colour just inside the edge of her arm, and then just gradually painted in a little bit of density there, so that it doesn't look unnatural, it doesn't look wrong, but it's just taking away quite a bit of that highlight. And if I turn it on and off, you can see just how much it's doing. You could choose to take a little more. I think that arm arguably could be a little bit softer down the edge too. That's easy to achieve by selecting the mask and having another go at it. These fine-tuning things are all the sorts of things we're likely to want to do. It's why I say it's a good thing with work like this to have a timeout. If you could save this in its layered form and leave your computer and come back tomorrow, generally speaking we do a better job. Otherwise we get a little bit too impatient and in full creative flow, and then it's not until tomorrow morning that we see the problems that we may have missed. But for a video I've got to continue, so what I'm going to do at this stage, I've saved this so everything I've got here is safely stored. I'm up to 4 versions of this particular image, but what I'm going to do is to select the top layer and almost all of the layers, not quite, just those that are constituting the young lady. I don't want the shadows because I want them to appear on the background. Didn't mean to do that. I wanted to select it. That's it. Now I can right click and I'm going to merge just those layers together. What I could do, if I knew I was happy with the toes and the shadow, I could do the same with them, but just keep them separate for a while. So select them and just merge those layers. But now we've got to turn our attention back to the background. Now I quite like the background. I think the tone is okay. But what I want to do is to make an adjustment with the softness of the background. I don't think I need this as a smart object anymore, so if I go to the right of that thumbnail I can rasterize it, because I want to make a copy of this layer. I'll hit Ctrl+J to do that. So let's call this our lady. And what did I call it lady for? Let's say this is our sharp layer and this is our soft layer. God knows why I called it lady. Because what I'm going to do is just turn these off for a moment. What I want to do here is to add a degree of softness, because I think if we were focusing on a young lady standing on that rock, that background possibly wouldn't be that sharp. So I'm going to go to my filters menu. I'm going to go to blur. There's all sorts of blur you can use. I'm going to keep mine simple with Gaussian blur. Now actually let's come back from this. I'm going to cancel that. Although I've got rid of the smart object, maybe it's not a bad idea if I actually reapplied one. If I go to the right of that and I reapply a smart object, just in case that when I apply the blur and I get this layer blended with this layer or masked with this layer, I then decide that the softness isn't right. Well then, if it's a smart object, I can go back and change the blur. So that would probably be a good idea. So filter, blur, Gaussian blur, because I've got a guess at the moment, haven't I? I've just got to make a calculated guess. So what am I going to say? Let's say 8 pixels radius and OK to that. When I turn the top layer on and select it, what I need to do here is apply a mask. Because what I can do is mask this so that the foreground stays sharp but the background drifts off into softness, which we've got on this layer. To be able to do that, I need to select the mask that we've just created. I'm going to use my X key to toggle my foreground and background colors, so I've got black as my foreground color. Going to my toolbox, grouped with the paint bucket that we've used, I want the gradient tool. From the options at the top of the screen, I want the linear gradient and foreground to transparent. So now I need to draw a line down the screen. There's my cursor right in the center around the water there. So I'm going to start just above. I'm just going to draw the line down to somewhere like that, so that I can keep most of this foreground sharp, but it drifts off soft as it goes into the background. And now I've got to make that decision. Have I got my mask in the right place? Do I need my mask to come down further than I have? I could hit Ctrl+Z and I could have a couple of goes at this, and when we're happy, then we can select the right sort of blur. If we think the blur is okay, then we can live with it, but if not, because we made this into a smart object, we can go back into the Gaussian blur and we can say, give me a little more. No, that's no good. So we can see we're going in the wrong direction there, but we could decide to maybe just come back a little bit. Let's try 5 instead of 8. Well, I'm sure you can see that we're all going to choose something different, and this is the sort of reason why we need a timeout sometimes, to walk away, come back and look at what we have a little bit later. But here I have my completed image. I've locked the layers away because I've saved my layered version and flattened this one. The shadows all looking good below the model there, and the softness all the way up. And when we zoom in, I think we can accept the hair. There's enough wispiness in that hair to make us accept, almost, that she was photographed standing on that rock.